So I'm here to talk about basically using Wardley Map. I've discovered Wardley Map quite some time ago now, and I'm finding a good use with organization design, and I'm finding a lot of work in that at the moment. So I thought I'd share that, Serge, today with you. Just as a quick introduction, and I'm not going to get into the detail of it, but I invite you to go and see a white paper about the Wardley Map CV, which I documented on my website at enco.co.uk/resources. And I'm likely to do more work next year because I already have new ideas about how to use Wardley Map for personal development. And I found it useful to actually do my CV in a Wardley Map. And a lot of you being expert mappers will notice that it's not starting from the user or the customer, but I explained that into the paper. And as you can see, I work as a coach, and I was a consultant for some time, but actually I'm realizing I need to be less of a consultant and more of a trainer so I can work effectively as a coach. And I also noticed that although the coaching has been very popularized by Agile, it is not something customers or clients really know how to use. And coaching in its purest form is also very interesting to explore because it's more to do with the being than the doing. And we were discussing some stuff earlier around that, where it is interesting to start working on multiple dimensions and actually connecting people with the being, which will facilitate the coaching and will probably bring coaching more mainstream. Whereas I think Agile has very much commoditized it, and we need to resurrect it for this true value. And that's why coaching is there. And below that are value maps around the training journeys, digital leadership, and so on. And I like working with some frameworks. And today I will use the Wardley Map. I will use also the team topologies. There's some hints of the flow system. I'm also ORSC certified and ICF coach. And I'm a big fan of Kinevin and all the work of Dave Snowden, generally speaking. So without further ado, and to simplify it, in short, I'm really in the business of creating high-performing team organizations and leadership in digital business. And if I take a step back, looking at Agile and what has really been the topic for the past 10 plus years in the industry has been the adoption of Agile as the miracle solution. And since the manifesto, Scrum has very much sort of productized, and Scrum itself is getting very much commoditized right now with iterations on the services or the training, like advanced Scrum Master, professional, and so on. And at the same time, we've seen the rise of a need for enterprise Agile. So it's not just the technology team; it's actually how can we deliver more, better value, and so on. And the enterprise Agile has taken a form in terms of product of SAFe, whether you like it or not, but the reality is very much out there. And that, again, is starting to commoditize. And a lot of people in the stage of their change and alignment and so on, are kind of gone through the hype and some despair, and some of them are still within the despair, to be honest. Some of them are kind of finding a plateau and sort of asking, was Agile was all about? Or are we done yet? What's going on here? And many organizations are really figuring out what's next. And if you get into the industry, what you get is really a narrative about doing better Agile or doing Agile better. And that is really iterating on the product itself and finding miracle cures or things like that, additional features, but it's actually spinning the wheel into that space. And I do believe that organizations are starting also to look at, well, how do we get work to flow? How do we get value to flow? And that's where we start touching on the digital value chain. And fundamentally, if you think about it, digital is business and technology working together. And where technology was some add-ons, to communicate, to be on the web, to communicate on social media and so on, they were all add-ons generally. Now it's really getting integrated into the value chain. And what we have to think about is how can we integrate the value chain between business and technology? And when you look into that, and that's not too dissimilar to what Steve was talking earlier about, you're trying to get some work to flow, some value to flow through the business, and you go through the business. Sometimes you have a change function, a product function, delivery, architecture. They all take an engineering pool with projects to deliver stuff, and then it kind of lands somewhere into support, and that's a very cumbersome way of trying to realize value. And when you look sometimes more into the technology itself, it's made a lot of components, and you have a lot of teams that are aligned by components. And if, like me, you've been around this business for quite some time, it always makes me think about going to the DBA team and trying to ask something of the DBA team. Is like they're really doing you a massive favor. Is it going to change anything into the architecture? And they're going to convince you that it's best not to do anything for some time. So when you have component team, it becomes a little bit like that, where people see the protection of their component rather than actually seeing the value that is to flow through the company and eventually via their components. So those ways of organizing are kind of difficult to get anything to flow through. And where do you go next? Where do you go now from? And a lot of people have talked about Spotify back in the days. It took really a lot of people loved the model, and it became the miracle formula. And then it got a lot of slack, and people saying, even Spotify doesn't use the Spotify model. And at the end of the day, it's good to actually try and understand, what was good about it, what is maybe not so great about it, or not so implementable in some places, because it did fit some needs. And I think there's still a lot of learning in the Spotify model. And a lot of people are talking about value streams, and of course, talking about topologies as well. It's difficult to figure out what's the value stream in an organization. It's not necessarily obvious. And sometimes, there's a clear cut, it's very easy, but some other times it's not. So here I'm kind of where do you decide the value stream? How do you decide that? And the topologies, and why not Wardley Map? And Simon has really talked about the pioneer, settler, town planner model. But I've been exploring how can we use value streams and at the same time reconcile it with the PST model. So that's what we'll talk about now. But just quickly, is there any questions so far? Anything? Am I losing anybody, or are we good on track and carrying on? If you want to put quick questions in the chat, if you have. All clear? Makes sense? Okay, let's get going then. So as we're getting going, I'm going to use the example of a holiday operator. It's a generic business, and I'm mixing a little things about other businesses as well. But it's earned from true experience. But of course, all the work is confidential, and it's not work you can share. So it's a generic business and fictional scenario for all matter that we're presenting here. And how the business is organized. And of course, the first thing you look at is actually the organization, the organigram. And on the business side, you got some brands that they go to market with, and you got some teams that look after the omni-channel, so wherever the customer tends to be buying from. And then the IT tends to be organized in terms of product, delivery, quite important, Scrum Masters or Agile, architecture, testing. So key functions that you will find in the process of software delivery. And of course, what you need to do is actually reach out to suppliers to do projects, because the business funds projects, funds initiatives, which doesn't warrant to have a permanent capacity aligned for that. And you end up having quite a lot of supplier as a footprint. And on one side, when you have that, what happens is, one side does the thinking and does the funding, and the other side does the execution. But in digital, it doesn't work very well, because technology is fundamentally helping to create new business value. So it's a question of merging them. The other problem is generally there's a change function in between. And that change function is here to control. And it kind of does a service to the business. So it keeps itself in existence, and it keeps IT at arm's length from the business. And when that happens, it's very, very difficult to actually get business and technology to work closer together, because change is in between and wants to keep their position in between, because that's their reason to exist, to create control. So untangling all this is actually a problem that many organizations tend to face. So the thought is, what can we reset the perspective using a map and using, of course, Wardley Map. So looking at a business of an holiday operator or tour operator is customers want to buy a holiday. And for buying a holiday, they will go to an e-commerce website, I think. They will be presented with packages that are made of activity options, and that relies on the catalog, which has a PIM and a CMS generally for the graphic assets and so on. And all this is generally using products, and there's plenty of product markets. For a customer, it's kind of, they're buying a product, so it kind of neatly fit into the product maturity for the whole value chain, to be honest. And then, they'd like to prepare the holiday. And what we need to notice is actually, when you sell a holiday, you don't want to have a very, very complicated, you want to have something relatively simple that the people can buy. And then there's plenty of time before they get to the holiday, which is an opportunity to actually configure it. So if you need to introduce complication, it's better to do it over time in the process, in the run to the holiday. And when you look at the value chains behind that, that means you create a sort of holiday page where people will go and configure. That gives plenty of opportunities to upsell. You may get a scheduler where the activity they bought, they can schedule in bands of availability calendars. And of course, you can sell more and get more happening at that time in the run to the holiday. And you generally access to another share of wallet, if you want. And then, what emerged with COVID as well, more so than before, is enjoying the holiday in a digital way. So how can people be connected in their holiday? And sometimes the feeling is, well, people go on holiday to disconnect, but actually, can you improve the holiday experience? And with COVID, because you need to reduce the face time, you tend to have more digital channel for them to organize their holiday, to organize their activities, and so on. And in that case, the value chain is having that on the device. It's no longer really the website that's going to cut it. And then you can have a diary that will, plug into whatever has been scheduled. And you can use as well that to check into the activities, for instance, so that all the paperwork, the reminders and so on are on the device rather than having to carry papers and so on. And you create value that way for people to enjoy it. And that's a very, very, very simple here map and value chain. But already when you look at it, of course, you would ask, oh, well, e-commerce, there are all packages out there. You can go Shopify, whatever it is. Should you? They're happy with what they had. And the PIM, oh, well, maybe there's some commoditized solution as well. Should you? Is that really something that is going to change the business for them? And interestingly, you may even question, and in that case, you could question actually the CMS. Sometimes you have a product that is really, really elaborated. And the thought is, well, their product, maybe we have more commodity even. But sometimes that's already overkill. And in one case I had, the customer was really saying, well, actually, we don't need all that capability. We're paying a fortune in license for something that we don't really use. We need to have something simpler. And in that case, sometimes there's a justification to go for something a bit more custom built. But fundamentally, that wasn't really the problem. The problem and the question was, well, we just need to have the flow working better. And it's not really about commoditizing stuff. It's just getting the flow better inside, what they had. And then it's then looking at, maybe we can identify value streams for a map. So if we look at that value chain of buying a holiday, there's a whole chain of things that are fairly self-contained in there. And of course, it's simplified here. If you look at configuring your holiday, preparing your holiday, again, there's a fair bit that is self-contained. And at the bottom, you can see that it starts joining to other value chains. And again, on the digital enjoyment of the holiday or managing your holiday with a device and through digital channels, there's a fair bit that is self-contained, but relying on something else. So here you start identifying some value stream, and interestingly, you start also where things join up. You have genuine question: is that an ownership into a value stream, maybe, or is that an ownership that could be at a platform level? And what sits into a platform, what sits actually into the value stream? And progressing to the topologies and using the reference around team topologies and the naming of team topologies here. Value streams are where the value flow. They are the teams that are customer aligned, and their prime job is to deliver value to the customers. And the idea is to get the value to flow as much as possible through those teams. All the other team types or team topologies in an enterprise are really here to support the value team to deliver value. And those are maybe made of platform, and the platform is useful to remove some elements of cognitive overload on the value teams to deliver value. So, setting up environments. Why should the team adding value worry about how do you set up an environment? Platform team should help them with that, or should have environment click and play and deploy straight away. Enabling teams as well are here to help them adopt change, adopt new practices. And then you have the core components, which are generally needed. And I was making a joke about DBA teams, but those are needed as well in infrastructure. And sometimes there is an element of legacy where those teams need to exist. But the key here with topologies is to think, well, all those teams are here to provide support, to add value. So you create alignment end to end, and you understand how you create an interaction and a connection between teams so that they support the value add. And whether it is actually working together, whether it is offering some APIs and refreshing those APIs and working ahead of the value teams, or other modes of interactions, but you identify the connection. So if we go back to our teams and just to remind you, we were with this setup here, we start seeing that buying a holiday can be a value stream. And it's a value stream that is maybe a little bit more commoditized from the other ones. And preparing a holiday is very much in that space of custom product and can be a value stream in itself. And enjoying the holiday is also a value stream of its own. And that one may be a little bit more to the left of the map, which is more the innovation that the tour operator is doing. And then you start identifying that the capability to support the flow. And as I was saying, what actually fits the platform. And in this case, catalog, PIM, CMS would be a real minimum platform. But you could, because all the value streams actually use that, but you could also think about, well, maybe there's a little bit more in there. Or sometimes actually the platform is not relevant and it becomes subsystem teams into the value streams. And then, there were also back-end components. So the core booking, the logistics, the payments, or core components at the back. And here it's about creating those connections across teams to supporting the flow. And let's progress, to from those value streams in that view to actually working with PST now, Pioneer Settlers Town Planners, for those that are new to Wardley Maps. And if you think about the value streams themselves, they are really very much about the business, that the business does, the work that the business does. And what you worry about here is basically flowing the demand and ensuring that the people actually work on valuable things. But at the same time, it's important to think about how do we identify improvements? How do we emerge actually some new thoughts from doing the work? What is emerging to actually consider in the strategy? And how can you keep that cycle going? And here, it's very much the settler space. It's about supporting the current work. And I think, very often in Agile, we think, well, all the teams are here to innovate. And that's where I think that Pioneer Settler Town Planner thought is good, because yes, all the teams should innovate, but have they got the time? And if you think, we tend to load their sprints, and we tend to load, if you do safe and so on, you tend to load their PI with a number of things that the business wants. And very often, there isn't a chance for them to load their own work with ideas they got. So the reality is the percentage that those teams can truly innovate, especially innovate beyond the value stream and the boundaries that they're working under, is very difficult. So in that case, it is about the settler type space, and it's actually getting them to work well in that settler type space, and thinking about how do we flow the work, how do we flow improvements, how do we flow emergence, and how improvement and emergence actually contribute to defining the work. Beyond that, something many organizations don't do. Many organizations are very, very happy to stay in the middle bit and just doing the work that they know how to do, doing the work that they are here to do, but not going necessarily much beyond that. And the first thing is looking how do you industrialize, and that's that town planning level. And all those core components, if they only serve one value stream, why do they exist on their own? And if they serve many value streams, how can we genericize them? How can we simplify them to bring them part of the platform? And that's where you start looking at simplifying the architecture by bringing some components into the value streams or into the platform. And that work is really needed because it's going to get you the headroom. It's going to get you the capacity to actually fill that empty space. And innovation, many organizations think that they have a problem in execution, but the reality is they have a problem in creativity and innovation. Execution is they can't get things done, which is a problem, I agree, but the bigger problem is they never play to the left. So they're just doing the work they do, and one day somebody comes and disrupt their space, and they're all like sitting duck because they have never really been able to innovate. So how do you go and fill that space? And that's where I'm playing around the idea that that Dave Snowden is talking about. And when you look at the Genesis space is really about finding out needs that the customer have and are difficult to meet, or actually identifying unarticulated needs and disruptive ideas. And I like how Dave Snowden says, complex adaptive systems scale by decomposition and recombination. And the idea in the organization is to have those teams that can connect into the existing modules of the organization that may reside in value streams, but that can identify and create new value. So how can you get those connections to happen? That new value can be experimented with. And as that value is actually discovered, then it flows into how we do the business. Or maybe it creates a new value stream of its own. And it reconsiders the view and the cut you had of the value stream based on a new value stream, new platform components, and now that redistributes. And that's where I'm toying with that concept, and we discussed that about roaming teams and how can we put and the main attraction for roaming teams would be to basically flex the capacity in the settler space where one day maybe or one quarter there's a big effort in one value stream and another quarter in another value stream, and you may want to have roaming teams that go and augment the capacity as needed and have the capability to work as a crew with all the skills needed to work in any places. So very highly skilled people. But you can also imagine that those people could work at the forefront as roaming teams. And in this example, for instance, if you wanted to upsell during the holiday, you can look at connecting basically the team creating this as a roaming team or skunk work, like you say, Steve, and plug into the value streams where they do the upselling, they do the device application, and bringing that together in a very, very simple experiment to actually release that as value to the customer and try it. And that way you do simplifications quite a lot. So that's pretty much how to match. And I'm working at matching the needs from some customers and using maps, and then working with the topologies to see how that map gets addressed by the teams. And it's not necessarily a quite straight, pioneer settler town planner. There's a little bit more around the value streams in the middle, which a lot of organizations need. And then it's a question of seeing the evolution, because once we achieve a level of flow with this, anytime you find new things and if time the environment changes, the flow gets disrupted, and you need to always adjust your perspective of flow. So the flow of value really is that flow of innovation, the flow of the work, the flow of the improvements, the emergence, and the flow of industrialization, all brought together. And we confuse very often flowing the work and flowing value. Flowing value is a lot more than just flowing the work, and that's the key message. And I think when we then shift around the operating model, and that's something I'm finding maybe is lacking a little in Wardley Maps, is the idea of the planning so far in many organizations is actually the reason for coherence of the organization. So how do you create coherence in the organization is generally through planning, and you want actually to distribute the planning into your value streams, and of course you're going to experiment into the more pioneering hand of the map, and then you settle those experimentation when they work. When they're becoming liminal, in Kinevin terms, between complex and complicated, you settle them into the value streams. But the interesting thing is when you want to create agency in those value streams and so on, you need to distribute the strategy, not just the planning. And that's where it becomes a lot more difficult in organization, because they don't necessarily have a structured way of doing strategy. Very often the strategy is actually a roadmap. So as you're looking to distribute the planning, how do you ensure the coherence across the value stream, across the work system? And generally it's through strategy and strategy deployment. And here, you have a level of the strategy being decentralized, meaning that the parts do strategy and they contribute to the central strategy. And there is a healthy process of cascade of the strategy, but also emergence from the value streams and the different places of work into the main strategy, meaning strategy becomes iterative. But ideally, you could go all the way as well, but it depends your work system, around more distributed strategy where the parts actually connect together to create new strategy, new perspective. But that's a lot harder to achieve, and I'm not sure all work systems are able for that. So the idea of distributing the planning and then using the strategy as the glue and the coherence across the value streams and across the whole system and the parts is actually where I'm looking at the moment. And that means working on the strategy with things like MAP and working with strategy deployment tools that will actually distribute, on the one hand, distribute, and at the same time create that emergent channel back into the strategy. So it's always in sync between the whole and the... So in conclusion, really, Wardley Maps can help with organization design. I'm convinced of that. And the few experiments I've done have actually worked well with it. The value chain really do help identifying value streams. And people that go with value stream mapping of the business to then get value stream mapping of change and so on, get really confused very quickly. Whereas the value chains and the approach of Wardley Map are extremely quick to identify ways of seeing the business. Business rarely have a view of end-to-end value chains, and when you start showing end-to-end value chains to leadership teams, it's revealing a lot of stuff. And people, you need to find a way to engage them, which is difficult because generally they don't have the time. But when you start doing that, it's actually really interesting. What we've done in a bank once is we had a 4-meter large board, and we were doing all the value chain, and we left it for about 2 or 3 weeks, and everybody was stopping to have a discussion. So that was a great way of gaining interest in that. Platforms do exist or have the potential to exist where value chains meet. And sometimes, you need to consider creating a platform. Sometimes you need to consider bringing services into the value stream and getting the value stream to work together. And that's always a very, very contextual choice to make. Most organizations tend to focus on the flow of work where they should focus on the flow of value. And I think once you do the value streams and you see those value streams in the middle, in the settler space, industrialization, innovation really broadens that view where the business starts looking at the flows of the business and how innovation flows into the business and so on. And finally, the strategy does all the coherence in the system instead of planning. So bringing the strategy as basically the common language and creating therefore agency in the system. And if you do the coherence of the system through planning, there won't be agency in the system. That's not true. So that's it, folks. I'm open to having discussions and questions. So reading in the chat, and please, if you want to join in, feel free to jump in. Skunk work, hide it under the rug until someone notice. Roaming thing is a much better idea. I'll end up and Steve, please come in. Are you here?
Hey, yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I'm just plugging in my laptop. Yeah, so I figured you're probably talking about value stream mapping when you're mentioning value streams, but you may not be. So I was thinking, okay, well, it would be useful for myself and the audience to understand, what do you mean by a value stream, and how is that different from a value chain?
That's an interesting question. A value stream is an end-to-end value chain at the end of the day. So
Okay,
value
so it's
stream
not
mapping,
like
forget the concept. It's a concept, value stream mapping is useful when you have a value stream and you look at where is the time spent, how can we optimize that, and so on. But the first question many people would have is, what's the value stream? What it should be? Because they don't, and you're not going to have that view by looking at the details. You're only going to have that view if you elevate the view. And of course, if you start taking a customer first perspective. So what does the customer understand of our business? And how can we, and fundamentally the value stream is about aligning the people that do the work as closely as possible to the customer. That's what a value stream is at the end of the day. And sometimes your value chains may be fragmented because you're going to have a part of it here, and then you have platform components and other components over there. But together they make up a value stream. So it's understanding the topologies in that case, and now you connect the whole topology end to end to support the delivery of value. So that's what I define as a value stream.
Yeah, okay. That's a useful definition there, because in my mind, like a value stream was more like almost like the process through which you enrich something to provide value, right? So, and you might think of like a factory production line as being that, like where you add the screws in and you bolt things together and all that. But there, it doesn't consider the fact that you need screws, which would be more like a value chain. How are those screws produced, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So I think your distinction is yeah, it's quite useful. It's
no,
more
but
like
that's
the
true.
flow of value across
In lean
chain.
thinking, you need screw is a consideration in lean thinking as a value stream. Let's be clear, because they will work with the supplier that they get those screws, just in time.
Mm-hmm.
And the perspective in lean is that you don't want to overstock the screw, because you overstock everything and then you have a massive inventory. So you work your value chain and value stream being fairly equivalent in that case, where end to end basically, and you may focus only on the value chain at one point, but end to end value stream includes the supplier bringing the screws in the right amount at the right time with minimal stock. And that's your end-to-end value stream. Yeah.
Cool.
So in that case, the value chains you identify through the value chains, you will identify your value streams.
Yeah, they'd be more bottom up, and then it might be multiple things flowing together, right? So I think I understand that.
And then you may have things like platform, and when you design your value chain, you may have a platform, and the value stream will use the platform. So the end-to-end value uses the platform, whereas you may create fragmentation in your system for good use, for reuse of stuff, for economies of scale. You may actually create fragmentation, but the value stream is bringing that fragmentation together. So it raises the question, how do we interact with that? Is it just an order form? Is it a collaboration? Is it actually a facilitation? There's three interaction mode in team topologies. Those are valid.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Cool.
And you had a question about roaming teams as well?
Oh no, I just thought it was a better idea than the typical approach at the moment for innovation, which is let's like put some people off. Well, they'll be on the books, but we'll hide them on the books, and we'll create a skunk works and let them experiment and stuff until either it fails or succeeds, and then somebody notices. So it's like that's one person doing something intentionally, whereas you're talking about a systemic kind of intentional roaming teams. Like let's look at like trying to create value by basically going around and experimenting on recombining, deconstructing and recombining. I think it's brilliant. So
It's
a great
yeah,
idea.
it's I think the idea of roaming teams is it's a bit the idea of crews in in Kinevin and
Yeah,
Cognitive Edge. They talk about crews. So creating really solid crews and not making, oh, it's not that expert there, that expert there. If you try and people bring a few people across the business together, the likelihood is in every 2 weeks they may find an hour. So how can you create crews and you give them, some missions, and
yeah,
maybe sometimes the mission is to go and augment some teams to actually deliver something absolutely essential around the business or a platform refresh, whatever it is. But the tendency would be, oh well, if they have idle time, when they're not needed. Well, no, if they have idle time, that's your innovation time.
yeah, exactly.
And if we can, create some overcapacity that we can maintain teams that will, look at disruptive innovation and thinking outside of the box, and in Kinevin terms, approach permeability of the boundaries that are set in the settler space and go a bit outside of that and still leverage whatever exists in terms of components and modules and so on into the business to actually assemble and reassemble things quickly, but also notice that that's a new value chain. And how is that value chain going to float? Does it fit squarely into a value stream next, or one of the existing one, or actually is it creating a new one for a new type of business? And that's, I think, that the idea of trying to decompose and recombine on the fly as you're running your day-to-day business.
Yeah, and I really like the visualization you had around that, where the strategy, like so, I guess leadership team is trying to embody that and create these teams, right? So it's specifically setting out to innovate by using this rather than doing the death by efficiency, right? Which is like, oh yes, so that person's wasting their time, they're not billable, for example. Well, okay, then we must be wasting something there. So let's get rid of it.
And
so you can optimize yourself, out of a business that way. So.
And equally, it's also important to notice, very often the innovation team is a small team that just goes and plays with technology. If they're not connected, that technology will never get application. So the other side of the coin, is actually to also think, how do you connect that into the business so that, innovation is not just playing with technology. It's actually something we look purposefully to apply straight away. And that's what I like about the PST, is that it's the idea of it flows. And I'm not sure completely about the process of stealing, but the idea that it flows. And how do we, and it's a very good question to executives, is how do you flow innovation? So we find something here. How does it go here? How does it go into those teams? How do you industrialize and regain headroom, or head space for innovation? And how are you going to restructure the teams for that? And those are really interesting conversations. So let's look at other questions we've got.
I'll drop off.
On distributed strategies, see, instead of well-designed strategies plotted out in sealed boardroom, executive needed strategies dynamic enough to receive market feedback. Yeah, I look at that, and I couldn't, agree more with this. I think strategy may have an element of how far can it be completely distributed versus decentralized, in the sense that, is it only left to the connectedness of the parts, or is there actually some glue in the center that holds also some sense of direction together? And that's going to be very, very contextual, how far it can be distributed, how far it is actually decentralized. But certainly centralized doesn't really work because the emergence doesn't have, and it's a strategy that becomes out of touch. And a decentralized strategy is an iterative strategy at the end of the day as well. What else have we got? Or value chains just made of value streams. So I think we had that one. Did we answer that? And platform delivered via platform value stream upon a value chain architecture leveraged behind SDLC values. Do you want the combine, Steve? I'm trying to figure on your question around platform delivered via platform value stream upon a value chain architecture leveraged by an SDLC value stream upon its own value chain architecture. That's a little bit difficult to get. Could you explain it further and join me?
Can you hear me?
Yep, all good, you're on.
I was just basically reflecting the challenge, because I know that this is kind of hard for people. I spend a lot of time in the value stream space, and I think that when I think of value chains, I think of value streams being the nodes in each chain most of the time, and sort of the capabilities of each node being delivered via a value stream, and most of those value streams consuming the capabilities of other streams. So in the case of what a lot of people I think bump into is, how does a platform relate to a software delivery lifecycle, like a product team that's leveraging the platform? It gets a little murky, right? When we think of the platform being delivered as a value stream, as a platform capability and product, where elsewhere in the value chain, these product teams are consuming the platform in their own value streams. And all of these have customers, right? You have an external customer, but the software product development team is a customer of the platform. And so it becomes this network, right? And you can sort of like put on different lenses to see it in different ways. And I find that kind of helpful, but it is very complicated.
Yeah, it is. And I think the platform is not so much a value stream, because the platform tends to be below, right? And the value streams are the one directly adding value. But if you look at it from a B2B perspective, the platform becomes, a technology that provides a service to other technology team. And you have some examples like, what's the name, Ocado, for instance, that created a platform around the pick and pack with like a 2 football pitch grid, I think, with robots, like Amazon has, but guided through airline traffic management system, I think they're saying. And that's the solution that they sell now. So they're not just in a business of delivering basically groceries to the door. They're actually also in a business of delivering a technical infrastructure and the software architecture that goes with it, and the service to other suppliers in non-competitive sort of areas. So in that case, what was a platform for their business has become a value stream in its sense of its own, or a service, a product of its own, that may have multiple value streams in the way they're organizing it. I don't know the details there, but it's quite interesting that a platform can become a B2B product, and there's going to be a lot more of that. AWS has been created like that. AWS was the Amazon shop, and then they started to do some e-commerce software as a service, and then that grew to become AWS today. So there are businesses that basically can spin off, and the commoditization side actually becomes a business of its own, pretty much. Was that answering your question?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that Amazon is kind of a classic example. I like, there was an example I think from Steve earlier today around the cost of a cup of coffee, and I see a lot of organizations in the near future hopefully making that calculus of like, what does it cost for us to provide our internal platforms, our internal services, versus outsourcing to a company like Amazon or some platform as a service, right? Wherever those platforms are. So I think we are in this pivotal point where companies are going to start to be able to see that and measure it. And that's going to be really interesting, because it'll lead to these decisions of do we keep this in-house? Is it worth it? Are we leveraging some kind of advantage by keeping it in-house? Or should we go with a best of breed tool from a company that's providing this as a service as their sort of...
The one word of warning I would have on this is, I don't think it's automatic to say because a commodity exists or a service exists. And back in 15 years ago or so, when I was architect, there would be a buy not build type mantra or heuristic. But I think we shouldn't necessarily assume because some commodity exists that we should necessarily go to it. And generally, yes, because you're not going to re-engineer your toaster, like Simon says. On the other hand, sometimes the commodities that exist are way overkill for your needs because they try and accommodate so many things. And that's where sometimes you got to wonder if a custom solution is actually worthwhile. But that's not a statement you can make black or white. It is always very, very contextual to your ability to do that, to the context of the tool, to the context of the commodities, to many things like this. And indeed, that opens some plays for commodities. But it's also useful looking at Toyota and a lot of Kaizen. I'm a big fan of Kaizen. And in Toyota terms and in Kaizen terms, you don't go and buy a very sophisticated tool. You first build your own tool. And the idea of that is the scarcity element helps you to really simplify your need. And it's part of the culture to actually go for simple solutions, and you don't go out and splash. And that's an interesting perspective, because I think mappers tend to think, oh, look, it's a map, there's commodities, we should go to that. It's not always the case. With that said, the value chain helps you making the choices of, we have this option or this option. This option has those benefits. And you understand the drawbacks of running your own thing. It's not, you're going to have to support it as well. So you make an informed choice, but we shouldn't think automatically that it goes to the right, in my view.
Totally agree. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm seeing a question from, I think it's Joachim. How do you handle resistance? My granddad was in the resistance. Do you want to join in, Joachim? And if I start answering, I don't know if Joachim will join, but if I start answering that, sometimes, and in organization change, it's interesting that, from a coaching standpoint, and I very often say, people underestimate what it takes to change personally. And they talk about change as a doing thing. They're not talking about change as a being thing. And when you coach people, and really coaching, it's very difficult to get people to touch deep down, why don't they let their team get on? And we're going to talk about, visualization of work and this and that and planning. But fundamentally, do they trust them? And what's there in the trust? How do you create trust? And people will then say, well, you need to earn trust. Well, if you never give the trust, it's very difficult for people to go and earn the trust. So there's a lot at the level of coaching around resistance, where you need to, there is inertia. There is definitely inertia. And that will create resistance. But unless you go and dig deep down into, how people feel in a way, you're going to try and rationalize things when the response is emotional. So as a coach, my first thing is understanding, well, with every change, it's an emotional element. And unless you address it, and unless you work with it, it is very, very difficult to actually go and overcome resistance. In terms of resistance, with maps, sometimes if you look at mapping your change, you can call it out. We're going to have inertia on that. And working with clients, or working in your own teams, you can say, let's accept we're going to have inertia. Now, what can we do about it? So when you put your black block and you say, well, that's the inertia, what are the factors of inertia here? What can we do about it? What time should we take? And when people want to actually progress quicker than the inertia will allow, of course it's going to result in resistance. So, but once you call it, then you can start saying, well, that's an edge for us. How are we going to go over that edge? And the quicker we discuss on that side of the edge, the later we're going to be on the other side. So you can have those conversations with map, and the maps can visualize. I mean, you need to figure mapping your change, but you can visualize the point of inertia and then discuss, how you're going to go over that. I think we're pretty much on time now. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that was helpful. Thank you all.